Of course, yesterday saw a different problem in Bengal with that cyclone battering the entire southern part of Bengal. So we are having problems every day, and we have to learn to live with all this. Having said that, I'll tell you that this topic of transfer of property is a very important topic in the lives of every person. Either you own property or you want to own property. If you have property, how do you keep it for future generations? How do you improve your property? These are largely with respect to immovable property. But the Transfer of Property Act 1882 was an act to amend the laws relating to transfer of property. It was not a consolidation act in any case. So therefore, the laws with regard to transfer of property already existed on the floor. But the then government thought that we should keep testamentary succession out of this and have a wider definition of property which could be transferred or sold without any fetters. Now, the section 3 to section 6 defines what is an immovable property, what are properties generally, because section 5 and 6 talk of any property. Section 3 limits it to immovable property. Our understanding largely is that the Transfer of Property Act caters to immovable property. According to me, it also transgresses into immovable property which do not fall under the Sale of Goods Act domain. The Sale of Goods Act came in 1930. That was clearly to do with trading and sale of goods. But here, if you have a movable property and you want to transfer, the Transfer of Property Act would take care of it. Now, the very basis of transfer of property was that if you own something, you have a right to deal with it any manner you want. The only exception was the law of eminent domain. And when then Article 31C was also taken out with the fundamental rights and reduced to 300A. The right of a person owning a property, more particularly immovable property, was governed by the provisions of this Act. Therefore, you could own and you could deal with the property in any manner you wanted to, save and except the government's or the sovereign's power to acquire a property and give you a fair price for it. So that is an exception to the Transfer of Property Act. That Act came in 1894, now it is the 2013 Act. But that does not really transgress into a right of a person holding a property and dealing with it. Now, we, in common parlance, we talk of freehold properties. We also talk of properties which are leased to us, yet we have a right to deal with it. I'll deal with those chapters later on. Now, the first major amendments to this Act came in the year 1929. A lot of amendments are brought into the working of the Act, like part performance was introduced. In mortgage conditional sale, a proviso was added. I'll come to the proviso later on when I deal with it. Then fraudulent transfers was improved in its application. Then section 69A with regard to appointment of receivers on a mortgage property, etc., was all added. Section 96 of transfer mortgage by deposit of title deeds was also amended. So there were various amendments. A total of the entire Act contains of 137 sections. The 29 Act brought in amendments to 47 of such insertions. Now, this Act has interconnection with very many acts because it deals with property of a person or persons. Now, I'll give you a few examples of acts which actually overlap with this. First is General Clauses Act. Section 3, subsection 26 defines what is an immovable property. Then you have acts like the Sale of Goods Act, 1930, the Registration Act, which is a very important act for registration of properties. Then the Power of Attorneys Act. Then you have the Indian Easements Act, which is again one which I'll deal with when I deal with lease and licenses. Then we have the Evidence Act, the Benami Properties Transaction Act, which now gets into this. If you have a property which is Benami, the government has a right to take it and acquire. So then you don't have a right under the Transfer of Property Act. Then the Contract Act generally, the Partition Act, Section 4, read with Section 44 of this Act will also be discussed. And you have this, the Debt Recovery Act and the Securitization Act, read with the IBC Code, which overlap with what the Transfer of Property seeks to give you or take away. Now, if you look at the entire scheme of the Transfer of Property Act, it defines first what is a property. it defines who can deal with such properties. It also goes ahead to say that if there is a fraudulent transfer, what is the option open to whom the property is being transferred. It talks of lis pendens, which is a very important section 52. We say that pending litigation, what happens if you seek to transfer? Would it fall under fraudulent transaction? Would it fall as an act which seeks to defeat the course of justice? Now, 52, in my opinion, actually is not dealt with properly by the courts in India. 52 has to be really strictly construed at the very inception. I'll give an example. For example, a suit is filed where somebody else is trying to develop on your property and you're trying to seek an injunction. Normally, the base court, wherever it is, the additional district judge or the civil court or the high court where the original side is, should immediately say that very well, if you do some construction or you change the nature and course of the land, then you shall not claim any equity if you lose the land. That's the concept of lis pendens, which is not normally given because we have these cases which travel up to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court deliberates over Article 30, Section 30, Order 39, Rule 1 and 2, and gives long discourses on what injunctions mean and what kind of injunctions happen. It is a simplicity of 52, which should be applied fair and square. Now, one very important insertion, 1929, was Section 53A, which is part performance. This had a lot to do with the 1877 Specific Relief Act. Now, people filing suits for specific relief could not really plead that there was part performance of the contract and there was no statutory force to such argument. So the 29 Act inserted 53A to give a kind of sword to the plaintiff or as a shield to a defendant in a suit, where you say that no, there was a contract, whether oral or otherwise. I have done my bit. And as you all know, 9/10 of law is possession. And I've also taken possession from my bit under the Specific Relief Act to tender whatever amount and get the property conveyed to me. So this 53A, if you look at the wording of 53A, it is a very important section for any title suit or any suit where you're trying to seek a declaration that you are entitled to get the property conveyed to yourself. Now, there are very many sections where sections can be used either as a sword or as a shield. Now, let us take, for example, Section 44 of the Transfer Property Act. I'll go a bit back and forth in this because the Act overlaps on various aspects of the matter. This you have to read with Section 4 of the Partition Act. Now, Section 44 says, if there's a joint ownership of a property which is not defined, that means the partition has not yet been effected by metes and bounds or whatever, then anyone selling such a property, the purchaser would be bound by the nature and character of the land, which is that it is not yet partitioned. The only thing that he cannot do is, if it is a dwelling house, to seek for partition of that property as if he is a co-owner of the original co-owner. What he can do is, if it's any other land apart from a dwelling house, he can seek a partition as if he is the original owner, though the property, that undivided portion, will be transferred to him. So there is a judgment of Justice Majumdar in 1996 and followed in 2000, where he has the right, he placed Section 4 of the Partition Act and Section 44 of the Transfer Property Act to hold that even if such a transaction takes place, there will be a preemptive right of the co-owners to buy back that property from the third person who has actually purchased that undivided portion. This is again an exception to the rule that if you have a right and title to transfer, it is not always unfettered. On a joint property, there will be checks and balances to stop you from doing a transfer which will affect the nature and character of the suit property. Let us say, or the property which is being sought to be transferred. For example, there are 5 shares. You say, I technically carve out 1/5 and sell. It's not a defined portion. A sale deed will have a defined portion, and for that you need a partition. So this is what is answered in the judgment of 1996 I'll just give you the citation because this will help you all in dealing with these matters. Just give me half a minute. Okay, I'll come back to it. I'm so sorry. I just got mixed up in my papers. But I'll come back to the judgment. Then after that, you have to really look into the working of the act before the chapter, which is the most important chapter in my opinion, that of mortgages. Before that sale is defined. Now, if you want to look at how a sale is to be effected, the sale is defined and in section, just before the chapter with regard to chapter 3 defines sale. And the sale is a transfer of ownership in exchange for a price paid or promise or part paid and part promised. Now, this sale has to be read with the Registration Act section 17 and section 49. Now, section 17 mandates that any property, which even a lease deed of more than 1 year, if it is conveyed and sold, you have to mandatorily register it with the Register of Assurances. If not, you have to do it within 4 months from the date of such entering into such an agreement to make that deed effective and the transfer complete. So a sale would mean that you have absolute right to deal with the property that you want to sell, that this property is a self-acquired property. On an inherited joint family property, again, like I said, you cannot sell till you go on to section 4 and section 44 of the Partition Act, 4 of the Partition Act and 44 here. So that sale would mean a complete transaction where A wants to sell a property to B. A has perfected his title by whatever means, has registered the title in his name in the Register of Assurances, and it wants to convey by a proper deed with all ills or without ills, free from all encumbrances or with some encumbrances, to the purchaser who seeks to purchase. And that transaction would be complete only when the deed is registered under section 17 of the Registration Act. So again, these two acts have to be read together. You cannot say that I have transferred a property, I am done with. The Registration Act makes sure that it is a proper transfer because you pay stamp duty on that document. The document is entered in the Register of Books so that future transactions can also be looked into by some prospective purchasers to relate back to the title, the original title holder or the subsequent transferees. Now, this is what we call recital in a deed. When we drop a sale or conveyance deed, you will say, whereas by so-and-so deed entered in so-and-so book, Rana Mukherjee transferred the property so-and-so. So-and-so transferred the property to someone else. He now wants to transfer, he or she wants to transfer to somebody else, or Mr. Murthy or somebody. And then those recitals have to be mandatorily mentioned in the deed. Now, many people skip those recital clauses, but they have to be done so that it's called the tracing back of the original title. Now, if you don't do it, the document actually is incomplete but complete for other respects. Now, what happens if the document is not registered under 17? Then you can only use it for collateral purposes under section 49 if you don't correct it within the 4 months given under section 17 and 18, I think, of the Registration Act. So again, this transfer of property entitles or enables you to do what you want with the property, but there are checks and balances that you cannot wantonly do whatever you want to do with the property. So therefore, you have to, this act, though it is one complete code, it is correlative with other acts which take care of certain aspects of this act to make it work or workable. Now, digressing here, before I come to the mortgage bit, a property, for example, you can create a charge on the property under section 100. Charge need not always be registered, though mortgage deed may be, is required to be registered. Now, on a charge also an actionable claim can take place. If you don't fulfill your commitment under the charge, the other person can file a suit and say that I want my charge to be exhausted. I want this property in my name. Now, what happens if it is a movable property?
Yes, ma'am. They can't create accounts.
Someone talking? Shall I continue? Hello?
Sir, please continue, sir.
Sir, please continue.
So, I've also spoken of part performance, which is relatable to specific relief act. Now, let me come to the, according to me, the most important chapter. That is section 58 onwards, chapter 4, mortgage. Now, I'll tell you, this mortgage has a very unique. in a very basic form, like I said, property touches everybody's lives in some form or the other. You either acquire it or you have it or you want to acquire something. Future transaction, you feel that, okay, I'll make some money, I'll get a property. It is a very important thing which controls our lives, which gives us some kind of liquidity and solidity. Now, there was one movie, a very famous movie of Balraj Sahni, where this gentleman had taken a loan from a village sahukar, and he could not repay it. And the story goes on to say that how he works as a rickshaw puller in Calcutta and tries to make good when that the moneylender had actually acquired that land by dubious means, by raising the interest to such an exponentially high level that this man, try as he might, could not do it. He lost his life. So these things are actually happening on the ground level. So what happens when a mortgage takes place? Now there are different kinds of mortgages. You have a land. You need some money for some purpose. So this land can be given as a security by way of 3 or 4, 5 kinds of mortgages. There's a simple mortgage. 58C, where the proviso was added, which says mortgage by conditional sale, which is a very important concept of mortgage, but not frequently used in India. There's one judgment of 1950, Chun Jha versus Ibadat Ali, which is a very important judgment in the citation. Then you have the other mortgages, which is the English mortgage, which again in India is not a very prevalent practice. There are 3 conditions to that. Usufructory mortgage is something which is done with agricultural property, where the rents and all are appropriated by the person who's the mortgagee to set off the mortgage loan. So therefore, the land actually is divested from the mortgagor and is given to the mortgagee, who would take the usufructs from the property. Now let me go back to a simple mortgage. Simple mortgage is whether without delivering possession of the land, you can create a mortgage and bind yourself to payment of the mortgage amount. And on the failure of that amount, the mortgagee can sue you either for foreclosure and file a suit under Order 34 and proceed against you. You still have a right of redemption. The CPC is a complete code to it. The section 60 also talks of redemption here, because once a mortgage, always a mortgage. That is the principle which is followed by every court. And there's a principle law which is settled and accepted by everyone. Now, the mortgage by conditional sale is where you take a loan and you convey a property to a third person as if it were a sale. Yet there's a condition attached to it in the same document, mind you. It has to be in the same document. That was the proviso added in 1929. That it has to be only in one document, which says that upon your fulfilling your liability or your liability under the mortgage agreement, the property will be reconveyed back to you. If not, a sale is effected. But just see the working of this whole act and the CPC, Order 21 also. Even at the stage of preliminary decree or the final decree, the mortgagor can always come up and say, no, sorry, I am now going to make this payment. Please do not convey the property absolutely to the person to the conditional sale. But Supreme Court in a few judgments has deviated from the property, because Supreme Court says that if it is not embodied in the same document, then there is no question of this being treated to be a mortgage by conditional sale. It becomes 2 separate agreements, and the other one can be a loan agreement, because that was the latest judgment of Supreme Court. I did not agree with the finding finally, but that is the law which is being followed by Supreme Court. It says that it comprises of a transaction of reconveyance in one document and not by a separate agreement. The logic behind it is to be found only from the 1950 judgment, which Justice Thakur in 2014 followed and distinguished mortgage by conditional sale with that English mortgage. Now, what does English mortgage do? English mortgage has 3 principal conditions, which is quite close to the mortgage by conditional sale, but the 3 conditions are very interesting. It says that the mortgagor binds himself to repay the mortgage money on a certain date, please mind you, on a certain date, and transfer the mortgage property absolutely to the mortgagee, but subject to a proviso that he will retransfer it to the mortgagor upon payment of the money as agreed. This is called the English mortgage. So these 3 conditions, according to Supreme Court, are to be read harmoniously together. Now, this introduction of English mortgage, which was there in the 1882 Act, and the proviso to mortgage by conditional sale makes that mortgage by conditional sale slightly different in its wording, to say that there is a conditional sale, there's a condition attached to it. Even here, there's a condition attached to it. But there you will have to make it in one document to show the intention of parties. So a document will read for itself. That is the law. You don't have to look at ancillary documents to make out what is the intention of documents with regard to conveyance of property. Because it's a very serious risk that you're taking. You want to keep your property as a security on the promise that you will make some payments under the mortgage agreement. And that agreement also has to be registered mandatorily under 17. Even a mortgage deed has to be registered. Otherwise, then Section 49 has to be followed. It can only be used for collateral purposes and part performance, 53A. So, this English mortgage and mortgage by conditional sale, there's a very fine line difference. But the mortgage by conditional sale, now today Supreme Court says that if the other document purports to be purely a loan document, then you cannot consider this to be a mortgage by conditional sale. That is the last judgment of Supreme Court in Atul Chandra Das in 2019. So that is where I have a little difficulty with accepting the contours of the judgment, because it does not take into account Chunchun Jha and Justice Thakur's judgment, which on terms hold as to why a conditional sale is a very specific document dealing with transfer by conditions attached to it, on the understanding that it will be reconveyed back, because it's already sold, back to the mortgagor upon his fulfilling his terms under the contract. Then the one that is most commonly used by our financial institutions and banks is mortgage by deposit of title deeds. This is a very common mortgage, and this is where the Debt Recovery Act, or even ordinary suits under Order 34 or the Securitization Act. Now, what happens here is, you as a constituent of a bank go to a bank and ask for some loan, term loan or loan against your capital assets, etc., etc. And the bank says that, bhai, where is the security? How do I cover myself? So you will then say that, very well, I have this property, and the bank will take an inspection of the property, will value the property and say, very well, it covers more than, it is 100% of the property, sanctions the loan. So the bank also has this EMIs which you repay. So that is the mortgage money under that agreement. This mortgage deed executed with the bank is to be registered with the Register of Assurances, and there will be an endorsement in the original Book 3 to say that, yes, this property is mortgaged, so that future buyers are not taken by surprise by the mortgager who would like to sell it to somebody else and run away from the mortgage without conditions attached to it. Now, under the Securitization Act, which is an addition to the Order 34 and the Debt Recovery Act, the banks and institutions have this right of securing the security interest, which is that property. So many a times what happens is, the property is valued 100 crores for a term loan, and somehow the constituent does not pay off that money. And the bank finds that actually the loan with interest and quarterly rest has gone up to some 200 crores, but the constituent paid only 50 lakhs or something, or 50 crores or something. The bank will at first instance serve a notice under Section 13 of the Securitization Act. You have a right to reply to Section 13(4) to say that, no, I have done all that I have to do. Except you can take defenses. But under the Madhya Chemicals judgment, even though defenses are not actually considered by the bank, and they first secure that property security interest, and can also put it up for sale by way of private negotiations also, which is provided for under the rules, securitization rules. What happens then is that property is sold, and the bank realizes its worth to whatever extent it can, and then goes to the DRT in the original application for realization of a certificate for the balance amount. It is almost like mitigation of losses. But even at this stage, when the security interest is being enforced, parties can go and file an appeal under Section 17 of the DRT Act and say that, no, see, I have, in my estimate, this is the amount which is due and I'm tendering this amount. Normally, the DRT will stop the sale and see whether your accounting for that amount balance is correct or not, and then the property sale should be finalized. Even Order 21 Rule 89 and 90, when a mortgage property is put to sale, there is a right of objection. If it is a fraud, sale by fraud, or if the purchaser feels that not everything was disclosed to him when he was buying, he can apply in 2190. 2189, even the person whose property is being sold away can also come and make a tender for that amount within 1/3 of that amount in the executing court. So all these are mechanics which work to make this entire act workable. Now, once Section 60 right is kicked in, that means the suit for foreclosure is filed or the Debt Recovery Act is initiated, then a Section 60 is always available to the mortgagor. You say, look here, I want to redeem. I want to redeem the mortgage amount because once a mortgage is always a mortgage, so I want to get back the property. Here's the money, please take the money, give it back to me. There are times when the courts also reduce the interest because in India, normally, you don't have these steepling interest rates which the banks calculate with quarterly arrears. The courts always take it rightly. They'll see the intention of the party. They'll say very well, he's losing his property. So they bring down the rate of interest to a more manageable amount and see whether it can actually be redeemed. And the court most of the times allow that property to be redeemed. Now, all this is under this chapter 4, which takes care of mortgage of properties. Now, if you can come to, there are improvements also on mortgage property, what happens there, then a right of foreclosure or sale. Then you have this very important, which is the right to sue for mortgage monies under 60A. And if you look at the Securitization Act, you'll find the Section 69A, appointment of receiver. Now, Section 13 speaks of Section 69A to say that a property either a receiver can be appointed for its protection, or because possession is not always handed over to the bank or financial institution, they are instituting the money. They only register the document with the register of insurance, but they feel that this person might, create some third-party interest in the property, get tenants, etc., etc. It will be very difficult for us to take care. So 69A is an option open to such mortgages like banks and financial institutions, even other mortgages, to say that please appoint a receiver. And if there are rents, etc., which are collected from it, please give it and keep it in a separate account for final adjustment in the suit. Now, this section you will find mentioned, like I said, in Securitization Act, because they have given this option under 13 to go for either or. You can have a receiver appointed and then proceed, or under the State Financial Corporation Act, Section 29, also had the option of going to the district court under Section 31, 32 to say that this property has been, they are defaulting, please allow me to attach. There also 69A can be kicked in, and it is independent of your rights in the Transfer Property Act. The only recognizable right which can be traced to a Transfer Property Act in these applications are whether you are the owner of the property and whether you had a transferable interest which the bank can now transfer to a third party. Now, this is how the working of the mortgage goes on. Now, I'm laying emphasis on this chapter, it is because almost every industry or every, let us say, small trader, at some point in time, risk their life savings by taking loans and putting their property to mortgage. So it has very serious implications. The implications are that you are actually losing your right to a property to a certain extent, with the only rider that you can redeem it once you fulfill your conditions. So the onus is mostly on you. On the mortgagee is to keep the property, if it is in their possession, to keep the property in good state and condition, so that the mortgager, after getting it back, does not complain that you have demolished and destroyed your property, you have put in third parties, I cannot now take them out. So these are checks and balances within the Act itself. Now, if you come to the very important section 81, which is marshalling of securities. So, for example, a mortgager is defaulting in some manner, but he has 2 or 3 other properties. He can, in the civil court or in a proper action, in a suit for foreclosure or something, say that, or in a suit for redemption, say that, see, I have this property as well, which can fetch a better price than me, and let the mortgage property be kept aside. let this property be taken as if it was a mortgage property and sell it. So it's like marshalling of your properties before a court of law to offer the best possible solution to any action that will be initiated against you or action that you have initiated for redemption. Order 34 gives both rights for foreclosure and redemption. So like I said, all these acts keep on following each other at every stage. Now, if you look at, like if I come back to the Indian, I'll come back to like charges. Subrogation is also a right, but it's more in insurance contracts, so I'm not laying too much of emphasis on subrogation here. It is not something which is very prevalent in property transaction. Now, charges is section 100. The charges is also a very interesting charge because it's independent of mortgage. It says the removable property of one person is by act of parties or operation of law made security. Please mark these words, made security for the payment of money to another, and the transaction does not amount to mortgage. The latter person is said to have a charge on the property. Now, this is a frequently used term in mostly the IBC and where suits are filed by secured creditors, where we say who has the first charge, who has the subsequent charge. So in the IBC, you will find that waterfall mechanism under 53A. We say that who has the right, who has a better charge on the property. So a charge can be created without creating a mortgage by a letter, by a document, to say that yes, you have first charge on the property. If there is some actionable claim, you shall have the right to claim it and appropriate towards your dues. The other charge is if there is excess left. For example, property is 100 crores, there's a default, but the money which is due is only 69 crores. So that money will be appropriated by the first charge holder. The rest of the charge holder will follow in line, which IBC gives a kind of mechanism which may not be appropriate in normal suits. But the logic is that charge A, charge B, charge C, B and C know that there is a charge A on the property. They take it, let us say, with the old concept of swine fever. They know that this is a property which is already charged, yet they are risking their investment by accepting a second charge because there is no other property of that gentleman. So they do so, knowing fully well that they will fall second in line in order of priority. So the charge actually in the normal civil action or in the IBC code becomes a very important section for enforcement. Now this can be created alongside mortgage, but a mortgager will then have a better right than the charge holder. If the mortgager has rights, if by deposit of title deeds, he will have the deeds with himself or herself, and will come to court to say that here are the deeds. Please allow me to sell the property. The charge holder may appropriate the property to himself or herself, or may occasion a sale. That is not explained in this act. It merely allows creation of a charge. So that is section 100, which again takes a little different shade of mortgage. The mechanics are almost like working of a mortgage, but is not a mortgage. The section itself makes it very clear that the person in whose favor the charge is created has an actionable right after a particular date. If you're binding yourself to an agreement of a payment by a certain date, or is an open-ended charge. For example, you say that after 10 years, I'll pay you so much of money and the charge gets free. So the property is free of charge. Again, you can deal with the property in any manner whatsoever. After redemption, also the property again reverts back to the original owner, and the owner can do whatever he or she likes. But there are cases where people have found that a minor's property has been mortgaged. A minor's property has been sold. In the Supreme Court in 2013, Justice Lodha said that if it is violative of Section 8 of the Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act, the option is with the minor when he or she becomes a major to apply to court to have the sale set aside. If it is not with the permission of a court. Section 8 mandates that any sale of a property of a minor's property, divided, undivided, would necessarily have to be applied to a court. Like in a trust property, you only have to apply to a court for sale of any property. So minor's property is protected in this manner. To say that you cannot deal with the property in any manner, even though you're the natural guardian, but you defense taken in that case was Noor Begum or something, was that no, I had done it for her betterment, for her upkeep, etc., etc. The court said it's not of the concern of the child. The property is of the child, of the minor. It is voidable at his or her instance. The transaction actually becomes void, but that option is kept open for the minor to say, very well, if the minor has a soft heart, he will say, oh, very well, my mother has taken care of me, or my father has taken care of me, I'll not deal with it anymore. But if not, then he or she can apply to a court to seek a declaration that that sale was null and void. So there's a very important judgment of 2013. I think I'd given a list of citations to Mr. Om Prakash. I don't know whether he shared it, but...
Sir, we will be sharing separately, sir. All the members will be sharing.
It makes it easier, otherwise... this Minority Guardians Act is 2013, 15 SCC 727 Saroj. I'll give it later on. And Hafiza Bibi is that which, this is a very important judgment. I'll come to it when I deal with gifts. Now, if you I'll come to the next chapter, which is again a very important chapter, which is lease and license. Lease, license is not part of this. I bring in license because that is important. Now, section 105 onwards is leases of immovable property. What does it mean? It means that you have a property. You can deal with the property. You can either sell it, create a mortgage, create a charge, or you can lease it to another person who requires the property. If the lease is more than a year, it has to be registered under Section 7 of the Registration Act. If it is less than a year, then you can call it a license under Section 52 of the Easements Act. Now, Indian Easements Act deal with licenses, which means they do not create any right on the property. It is a merely usable right. So Section 52 of the Easement Act creates a right for you to use a property in a manner, it may be reduced in writing, in a manner in which the licensor wants you to use it. It can be for residential. Now we know how people beat the law by saying that, very well, sir, you can continue for 3 years, but we'll do it for 11 months each. So we need not register it. So that's a kind of, you're technically cheating the revenue, but it happens every day. I mean, that's the way it is. And you have a renewal clause of 1 year, which actually, if someone were to look into it, would say that, no, this actually is a license, is a lease. You've actually given the option, but people accept it. The revenue authorities also don't look deep into it. But the moment you enter into a lease of more than 1 year, with a defined term or in perpetuity, then Section 105 onwards kicks on. Section 107 delineates the rights. 108 also speaks of your rights of the liabilities of lessor and the lessee, Section 108. That means periodical rents are to be paid. Or, there can be a right of subletting also given in a deed. If not, on grounds of subletting, there can be a forfeiture. So that subletting right, the lessor can impose strict conditions on the lessee that you shall not store hazardous material, that you shall not induct persons of certain categories. Someone who's Act just lays down what are the rights of the lessee. So now, interest is created in the leasehold property. And what is that interest? The leasehold property can also be, mortgaged by the lessee. But the law says that it has, normally the institutions don't take any leasehold property which has, let us say, less than 75 years residue lease left. Because that would ensure that the payments would come in, so rents are appropriated. But that mortgage of that kind of property would have its own conditions. The banks and financial institutions also, at times in desperation, take all these rights to their head because they don't want a situation where suddenly there's some forfeiture notice sent by the landlord. And they also fall hook, line and sinker for the Section 111 notice. And they throw out the ostensible occupant now, which becomes the bank who says that, okay, the rents are coming to me. Now, in the Madras City Tenants Act, we recently did a matter in the Supreme Court, where the argument of Section 9 and Section 11 of whether notice is to be served. Rent control acts, now I should again go back, step back a bit. You see, the Transfer of Property Act deals with transfer of properties, which is a central act. After independence, in fact, just before independence, after independence, every state decided that since land laws are state subjects now, there should be rent control laws, because this was kind of very, very difficult act. 111 notice would mean that you're bound to be thrown out. And after that point, you'd be a tenant at sufferance. And a suit would proceed. So they said, no, the tenant should also be given some protection. So rent laws were introduced, almost every state across the country. So one such act is the City Tenants Act of Chennai, which was actually 1910. It has been amended a number of times. And in the City Tenants Act, an argument was advanced that, petrol pumps, etc., when they appoint agencies under the agreement, whether that would be a ground to throw them out for saying that you have actually sublet and you have made constructions. Supreme Court unfortunately held that yes, this is a ground for eviction. We had pleaded. I was appearing for some of the petrol pump owners, unfortunately. We had pleaded that no, it will be governed by Section 111 of the Transfer of Property Act. But these are long leases. And you cannot import City Tenants Act into the working of these agreements, when the agreement is with consent of the landlord, that we will be appointing agencies, because no petrol pump, apart from those COCO, COC or company-owned, company-operated petrol pumps, operate a petrol pump on their own. They give it to agents. And that was the big scandal of Satish Sharma long back. But Supreme Court held otherwise. They said no, Madras City Tenants Act would have primacy over such subjects and directed eviction. So 111, actually you find in a suit under 111, when you give a notice under Section 111 on certain grounds which are available to a landlord or the lessor, the usual defenses are taken. But the Act also gives the lessee a right, like you redeem, you pay, if it is a default for rent, you pay that amount and make good, and then the suit would be disposed of. Otherwise, there's a waiver point, that is a waiver point. Otherwise, if under 116, the landlord, despite filing a suit without reservation, starts accepting rents, then the effect of holding over is also provided for under that. So once you do that, the only residue of the earlier amount would tantamount to a balance which is a money claim. So therefore, if effect of holding over would mean that the court would take a softer look at your defense and say that now that the landlord has also allowed him to perfect his defects, let the property remain with the lessee. On the condition, they can impose conditions and dispose of the suit. This holding over is a point which is commonly used in civil courts as a point of good defense for a lessee who would have at some point in time defaulted. But the other grounds which can be of destruction of property, which can be of various other grounds of induction of a subtenant without notice, or induction of a subtenant without there being any provision under the original lease deed to induct subtenants. There, 111 kicks in with all force. But as we know, a civil court takes its own time to dispose of these suits of recovery of possession. Therefore, the state governments felt that we should have a rent legislation which will take care of the larger interest, not long leases. Though Bengal had a provision of 21 years lease, which was upheld by the Supreme Court, we said that even then it will not be under Transfer of Property Act. But to say that both the lessor and the lessee, or the tenant and the landlord under the Rent Act, would have respective rights and liabilities and protection. So every act gives protection to the tenant against eviction on certain grounds, like bona fide requirement. Those are not grounds which are normally available here. Bona fide requirement is not one which is found under the Transfer of Property Act. It was introduced in most of the rent acts to give it more teeth. Where people are fighting for recovery of possession, and they said, no, the tenant is here for ages and we need, my family is expanding. Those are not available under Transfer of Property Act. Please note this. The Transfer of Property Act is a wholesome act where rights and liabilities with regard to a property are created independent of rent legislation. The property is still a transferable property under the TP Act. Please understand this. The property remains a property in the Transfer of Property Act domain Yet you choose to give it for short-term rents or month-to-month rent under the Rent Act and expose as a landlord to the rigors of that act. Let me put it that way. The logic is, which I find, is that most people find the Rent Act to be more receptive to suits for eviction. Maybe a misnomer, but it is how the logic actually developed over a period of time. So every state has this act. Now, I come to the last chapter of this, which, of course, I did not mark it as a discussable item in this talk. But gifts is a very important chapter, which is chapter 7 under the Transfer of Property Act. Now, like I said, though section 4, 3, 5, and 6 define what property is, it normally section 3 talks about immovable property, as is discussed in 326 of the General Clauses Act. But section 5 and 6 talk of any property. So it covers almost, though the understanding is immovable property is dealt with under Transfer of Property Act, the understanding is anything which is not under the Sale of Goods Act, which means you are not a trader, you're not in the business of selling goods, but you are selling your personal effects and artifacts to someone else by an agreement or otherwise, would be governed by the provision of Transfer of Property Act. So one such transfer element has been provided for under the chapter heading of gifts. Now, what is a gift? A gift is where the gift is also to be registered. There was a Gift Act which got under the Income Tax Act, governed by the Income Tax Act, which got abolished in 1998. I think it was 58 Act, where a percentage of the revenue was, the gift value was taxed. Now, what happens when a gift is occasioned? For example, a father wants to gift it to a daughter to the exclusion of others. These are not intertestamentary succession moves which are under the Indian Succession Act or the Hindu Succession Act. These are independent of that, which Transfer of Property Act gives a right to say that, see, so much of that property I want to give to my son or daughter, my granddaughter, that can be by way of a document. And the gift, the donee has to accept with all conditions attached if there are conditions attached. For example, there can be onerous condition attached to the gift that you shall pay so and so. Now, in one such gift deed, the matter came up to the Supreme Court with regard to a Muslim lady gifting some property to one of her kin. The Supreme Court held that since under their law, the customary law, a hiba or a gift may not be in writing, can also be oral. That need not be registered. And if that is so, if a hiba is proved, then non-registration will not make that gift null and void. I hope I'm making myself clear, because gifts under our succession law would mean that a person who is owning a property is willing to gift it to someone of his or her own, can gift it to a third party also, but would have to pay stamp duty. So we'll have to pay stamp duty, which means that you have to get it registered to make the gift effective. Now the donee can accept or may not accept. The donee said, no, I want to revert it back. I don't want it. But in a Muslim thing, it does not get invalidated merely because it's not registered. That means you're not paying stamp duty. But their law recognizes that a gift can be oral as well. We do not recognize an oral gift, apart from Muslims, to be made effective otherwise than on, let us say, personal effects, and which need not be documented. You can gift it without there being any documentation. Someone takes it and takes possession, that becomes his or hers. But if you are dealing with transferable property, immovable property, then a gift would have to be done by a gift deed to be accepted by the donee, given by the donor, either with condition or without conditions attached, and that makes the gift complete. Now, this is insofar as the working of the Transfer of Property Act is concerned. Now, like I said, it is not an exhaustive act. The act actually gives teeth to what is an immovable property, what is transferable property, and how are these properties going to be governed by some law. So the act actually says this is an act to amend the law relating to transfer of property of act by parties. So it's not a consolidation act. It is not consolidating 2 or 3 acts to bring it in line with some act. It merely says that earlier law with regard to transfer of property, which were first by the British East India Company, used to have those ordinances. And then the CPC came in. And then the Specific Relief Act of 1877 kicked in. And this came in 1882, which really set about the contours of how properties are to be dealt with by individuals or by associations, firms, etc., etc. So a property right which under this act would speak of a right which is perfected by doing certain acts, which means it is, even if it is by intertestamentary succession, some property devolves on you, you still have to, maybe a probate is not required in many states, you still have to get your name mutated into the revenue records or the municipal records. Mutation does not always confer title, but it does give you a right to say that this property is mine. And you have the option to get it actually registered, entered into book 3 to say that today I am the owner of the property. So what happens if it is put to probate or you seek a declaration? The decree would be that which has to go to the revenue authorities to make endorsements in the register. That gives you a right, unfettered right to deal with property which is now yours. And in acquisition, for example, you acquire a property with your own money or whatever. That property, in any case, when you buy it, if you get it registered under Section 17, that property is yours whole soul. You can deal with it in any manner you want. Now, what happens in a normal circumstance? A property is actually a kind of security for any person living. You cannot hold a property in a dead person's name. Nor can you actually, for an unborn person, you cannot have a contingent purchase of property. Though there have been occasions where people have done, it's almost like a testamentary gift, let us say, bequeath, to say that, okay, my daughter-in-law is expecting, my son and daughter-in-law are expecting, that so much of so property would go to them. So that almost becomes like a living will. It is not recognizable technically under Transfer of Property Act because it's not a kind of crystallized property form which is to be transferred. It is only a desire of that person to say that if such and such a child is born, that this much of property will go to him or her. So this lays down the contours of the property, the holding, the right to deal with it in any manner that you want to, the exposure to controls the moment you go into creation of a mortgage, charge, or let it out on lease, long lease. There, the original landlord will obviously be controlled by the mechanics of this act. The mechanics of the act make it very clear that once you let go of your little bit of holding, that is, some bit of your absolute ownership vests now conditionally upon a third party. You will not be able to deal with the property anymore till you fulfill your conditions in any manner you deem to. Therefore, this section 53 of fraudulent transfer also came about. Lis pendens also came about. Lis pendens is, for example, in a suit for specific performance, like I said, someone sues that you are not, I have done my bit under the contract, you are not conveying the property, and files a suit under section 10 enables you to file section 13. And the court says that, okay, what is it? Well, I see for the last 10 years, I have paid my money. I'm in possession of the property. I'm realizing all benefits out of the property. It is only a mere signing of a document. So normally the presidency courts, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras would pass such a decree, a conditional decree, that the landlord would convey the property in, let's say, 2 weeks from now, upon payment of the stamp duty, etc., etc. Failing which, the registrar or the master of these 3 presidency courts, which was later followed by Delhi High Court also in the original side, or even district courts, to convey the property as if he is the vendor. So these are, workings of the Transfer of Property Act to make it wholesome and to give it more teeth. Now, if these controls and measures are not given under the chapter heading of mortgages, then a person very well would create a mortgage and then dissipate the property, do whatever he or she wants to do it. So there are checks and balances like hypothecation of movable goods. So there's a hypothecation deed created, the bank or institutions or whoever to whose favor the hypothecation is made, they will go and inspect whether at all the goods are in good shape and condition. Similarly, property also. If improvements are made without notice, you're making it at your own risk, because when you seek redemption, you may or may not get that amount of money, because the mortgagee will say, you have done it without my consent. You have changed the nature and character of land. Why should I suffer? But there is a provision. It says that if it is beyond that portion of, when you're redeeming it, or if you're not able to redeem, if it's a foreclosure, then you can get that benefit if it is outside the limit of the mortgage amount. So these are the way in which the transfer of property circulates. Now, like I said, the part relating to lease and long leases has always been a matter of great concern with courts interpreting these clauses. Section 111 has been a matter of number of judgments of the Supreme Court. Some say it is absolute. Finally, by the time a matter, a suit, a trial court reaches the Supreme Court, it's maybe 10, 12 years. And in a rent control action or in transfer property action, the usual order is where you have enjoyed the property, let the landlord get. But in a transfer property act, the lessor actually has a lesser right than under rent control act. Please, let me put it that way. He has a better right to, under 111, to seek forfeiture of the lease. But when it comes to realizing the property, it is more onerous because you still have to prove certain things. Unlike rent control, where the tenant also has the right of say, here also you have a right of defense. But the defense of the Transfer Property Act takes a long time, issues are framed, evidence is led, and it goes on to the extent that where the Supreme Court also feels by let the landlord get back his land. I mean, enough of litigation. Transfer Property Act, most of the time the court says, no, if there's no substantial question of law, we will not give in favor of the landlord unless only there is a forfeiture of a great nature. For example, demolition of a wall. The court will say, you have demolished the nature and character, please get out. Now, while on this, I will go back to the Code of Civil Procedure and request you to take Order 34 and Order 21, Rule 54 orders. Because this would be the end of my discussion with regard to how mortgage property is to be dealt with. Now, if you look at Order 34, proscribes a suit for foreclosure. That means you're not servicing your loan or mortgage amount. The bank or financial institution or whoever, private money lender also can go to the suit court and say, I'm foreclosing my loan, please sell the property, appropriate, do whatever, make the property. Or the bank will say, in any case, title deeds are with me, allow me to sell, etc., etc. But now these acts have come about for the banks and institutions to engineer independent action, not under 34, because 34 has gone to be, let me put it, damning slow. The process itself was so slow that the legislature felt, now this is getting too much. So they first brought out the RDB Act, which led to the Mardia Chemicals judgment. The Securitization Act. RDB Act came where the challenge to the Act went to the Supreme Court, where Section 19 amendment was brought about. Certain protection was given to the constituent also. So 19 was amended because of the Supreme Court judgment, where the Delhi High Court struck down the RDB Act. So now, Order 21, Rule 54 actually sets about the rights post-decree. So therefore, like I said at the initial, once a mortgage, always a mortgage. Your right to redeem remains till a sale is occasioned. So till such time, you can still go to the court and say, look, this is the amount with all interest. Please let my property not be sold. The court would normally take cognizance of such a plea. And even at the execution stage, let us say 8 or they say very well, we'll allow you to do it, but you have to deposit the money within a certain framework of time. Some courts are stricter. They'll say you have allowed the court process to go on for, let's say, 20 years. And now the mortgagee wants to sell the property. He has nothing to do with it. He wants his money back. So please do it. The court may refuse and say that take it. But if it is redemption, the entire amount has to come from the mortgagor. So Order 21, Rule 54 to 90 deals with the whole procedure post-decree as to what is to be done with such properties, a mortgage property. So therefore, like I said, Rule 18 and 90 provides for application to set aside sale on deposit. So the deposit provision is there, has been sold in execution of a decree. Any person claiming an interest in the property sold at the time of the sale or the time of making the application or acting for. Now, this any person can meet the mortgagee also, or any other person who has interest in the property, to apply the sale set aside, provided they deposit a sum equivalent to 5% of the purchase money at first go, and for payment to the decree holder the amount specified in the proclamation so and so, where the date of proclamation has been received by the decree holder, or where the person applies in 90 to have the sale set aside. Now, there was a case which, again, fortunately I was doing, where the argument was of limitation and of at what time can you really tender that amount to make the sale set aside. Now, this was the Bangalore case, where the Bangalore High Court also felt that the mortgager had played drugs and brakes with the court. After 10, 12 years of the property being put to sale, they had come up. But he had a good defense to say that no, the property has to be sold within 1 year of the proclamation. That is what the CPC provides for. But that was overridden by the fact that somehow that court, the judges got transferred and there was no hearing for about 8-10 years. Fortuitously, for the auction purchaser for whom I was appearing, Order 21, 8990 could not kick in favor of the mortgagor. The court also, Supreme Court also felt that here was a case where you should have deposited the money when you made that application in terms of that proviso to the Act. To say that within 3 weeks you have to deposit that amount, 5% or 25% or whatever, and then you have to put in the amount under clause B in deposited in court to show your bona fides. These are all equitable remedies. The Transfer Property Act actually hovers around equitable rights of parties dealing with properties. That's why the Specific Relief Act is an enabling provision, and therefore 53A, like I said in the beginning. So, a mortgage till the last stroke of the hammer is a mortgage, liable to be redeemed. This is a larger reading. Some courts may have taken a different view on this, but the larger reading of Supreme Court and other high courts, including Madras High Court, has consistently held that you give the mortgagor a chance to redeem the property. Because it's a death blow, death knell to a person who has the property, who has let it out for what ABC reason, fallen into bad times, could not service the loan, and the property is put to execution or sale. So this is how the Transfer Property Act, the mechanics of the Act rotate. So like I said, there are so many interdependent acts on making this Act a complete code. It is not a standalone code. I'm repeating, this is not a standalone code. There are, like in 1929, 47 amendments were brought to the Act, when they found that the Act had to really correlate to so many different acts. And mind you, 1930 was when the Sale of Goods Act was on the anvil. So they were aware of the fact that Sale of Goods Act would kick in a year's time. 29 brought in part performance, 29 brought in fraudulent transaction amendment a little bit, 1929 brought in section 69A, etc., gave the Act more teeth to make, let us say, a mortgage complete, enforceability of a mortgage complete, redemption under the mortgage complete, and the transfer of property to be taken to its logical conclusion with regard to rights and liabilities of parties. On the aside, one interesting trivia for young associates, seniors would know. There was a provision of under the Presidency Towns Act, which related to Delhi, Bombay, and Madras, of being able to register any property situated in any part of India in any of the 3 presidency towns. Now, what happened was they realized that this was creating a lot of difficulty. In 69, there was an amendment to the Registration Act, and they amended to bring in Delhi also as a part of, because it's a national capital territory, they thought it would have a national color. So they allowed Delhi Registration Office also to register and accept such documents of a property situated, let us say, in Tamil Nadu, or let us say in Maharashtra or wherever, to be registered in these 4 towns. Now there 2 very important judgments came. One was with regard to this parliamentary sale and people getting the property registered. And they found that mostly Delhi people were running to all these 3 different not getting it registered in Delhi but getting it registered there. Property in Patna being registered in Chennai. And for the next purchaser to buy, it became very difficult to really trace, to go to Chennai and trace the history of the property. So they brought in an amendment in 2002 to curtail that practice of having it registered in the three presidential towns and Delhi. So that was an amendment to the Registration Act and to the Transfer of Property Act with regard to registration. Now, one very important judgment which people should know, that such properties, mostly in Delhi, which are mostly leasehold, were ostensibly sold under a power of attorney. So that power of attorney would be a registered power of attorney which would carry a consideration amount. The power of attorney would be registered. But since the power of attorney is not recognizable under Section 7 of the Registration Act, that power of attorney sale would be, there would be another power of attorney because there would be a special power of attorney. See, there were 5-6 documents created at one go. A rent agreement, an agreement to sale, a general power of attorney, a special power of attorney, and a will. So 5 documents used to be executed in Delhi to convey property to a third party without a proper conveyance deed. Now all these matters came up to the Delhi High Court. Full bench held that this was not a practice which is legal. There was a difference of opinion. Finally, the matter landed up before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a judgment called Suraj Lambs, held on terms that any property which is a transferable property under 1882 Act, liable to be conveyed and sold, would have to necessarily be a property which is conveyed not by a power of attorney, but a deed of conveyance under Section 17 with requisite stamp duty. But had a cutoff date, any transaction before that date of the judgment would be declared valid for the purposes of transaction. But after that date of the judgment, all such transactions were declared null and void. There was a subsequent clarification. But this judgment is very important. Like I said, Power of Attorneys Act is also a recognized mode by which a landlord can give his or her power to a third person for him or her to convey a property on his or her behalf. So they can be destitute people, old people who have given a power of attorney. But there was a menace by this provision, so they curtailed that in the judgment of 2011, I think Suraj Lambs of 2009, which is a very important judgment with regard to power of attorney sale. I'll put it in inverted commas. So I think this largely covers the contours of the Act and attendant acts, like I titled it. So Mr. Om Prakash has, I think, notes on my judgments and etc. That I think people can have a look at it. Now, should I end, or is there anything else that you require me to address?
Sir, you want that notes to be put on screen, sir?
It depends. If they want, if the juniors would require.
Normally, we thought we will circulate in the WhatsApp groups. They will have it. Something which you want to specifically point out, we'll put it.
One citation I'll give and a few judgments I'll give, which have a bearing on everyday dealing with transfer of properties.
Yes. Can you just permit me share? I will just.
1 minute.
Because I like it this way, just talking off the hat and then.
Yes. I think we can go ahead with some question answers, sir. Anybody has, so that we don't stay back. We will share all the notes to the members in the WhatsApp.
Okay.
So if any members have any questions.
I should have added this. Section 83 also gives the power of the mortgagor to tender and deposit the amount, like I said. Also in Order 21, the provision is there, but the Act itself provides for tendering of that amount. And on such, the interest will cease, cessation of interest of the mortgagee, because he gets the entire amount back as is under the agreement. So that was one thing which I should have pointed out. Yes.
So anybody has any questions, it can come.
Sir, thank you very much for your session, sir. It was very nice. I had questions on every topic when you started, but later you covered everything, except one thing, sir. That is, when you spoke about the gift deed, Hibba. That was a gift deed also. You said the Hibba can be oral.
Yeah.
But while proving the hibba, can he show the gift deed or a will?
The fact that the donee has accepted the gift,
Okay.
and it is your word against mine. So this judgment, just 2011 5 SCC 654 deals with this. It is called Hafiza.
1 second, sir. 1 second, sir.
2011.
2011.
5 SCC 654. Even gift on a plain piece of paper is not invalid.
Okay.
And in
Muhammad
law, you have this Mohammedan law. You have this provision of oral. Yes,
hibba.
the gift would be there at the end of after leave and license. Then we will get it there.
Sir, which one do you want to share, sir? Now I have got two things. One is transfer of property, and the other is lease and license, sir.
After that, gift should be there at the end of it. Just have a look.
One second. After lease and license.
Shiva, in the last page, gift will be there. The last
One
portion.
second. One second.
I hope it is there. Yes, it is there. From page 6, essentials of gift. Page 4, after page 4.
Gift, sir. Page 6, sir.
Yes.
Gift is here.
There you find that suspension at page 7. You'll find it. Suspension of Mohammed law, this, that, and the other. Gift to a minor is also dealt with.
No, before that, Shiva, you have to come up. Here. After this, essentials of gift,
Yes.
then just scroll down.
Yes. To accept it, it again has to be accepted by the donee.
Still down. Suspension or revocation of a gift.
So that 2011 judgment clarifies everything. It follows the Calcutta High Court judgment, which it approves. 1930 or something.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I'll go through the notes and also judgment.
Sir, one small clarification or doubt which I am looking at is that the right of redemption is protected under the TP Act, Section 65. Now, with coming into force of the special enactments like SARFAESI or IBC or anything, somewhere is it not that that right is being defeated now? Take the case of SARFAESI. They have said now, under the rules, they said the moment a sale notice is published, your right of redemption is lost. But if you go back to Transfer of Property Act, till the transfer is completed.
No, 13.4 gives you the right. Before the sale is effected,
Yes.
you put in that amount. That is what the whole scheme is. So these are overlapping. That's why I said these are overlapping acts. They have given
Overlapping to some extent, is it not that these new acts are defeating the old provisions? For example, in TP Act,
that was argued.
okay.
The Supreme Court said these are special enactments for financial institutions and banks, and they give empirical data to say. And I'll tell you something in this juncture. If you look at the website, you will find 66% of cases in Indian courts are with regard to property in some form. Some dispute with regard to property, land acquisition, or transfers, or sale, or under these acts. Now the new dimension of IBC has also come. IBC also has taken overriding provisions because Securitization Act and DRT Act have been amended to bring in the power to the IBC to enforce default.
And as regarding this lease and rental, is there any difference? Because some judgment seems to say, though it is a lease, it is protected under the Rent Control Act of a state. So it is only a tenancy. Is there anything which we can differentiate as a lease or tenancy or rental?
I'll give an example. The West Bengal Premises Tenancy Act has a limit of 7,500 as a lease monthly rental and month-to-month tenancy. You have to say month-to-month, though the 1956 Act, now it is amended in 97, had a provision of 21-year lease which was held to be under the Tenancy Act. Every Tenancy Act, Delhi Rent Control Act also has a limit of the rental and the period. So it has to be a month-to-month tenancy. A lease would have a fixed period lease, more than a year, etc. Rent control can also be more than a year, but it will be governed by the rent control provision. That is a election of the parties to take whichever act they want.
So both will mean the lease only. It is effective a lease.
It is let us say it is an agreement for rent under the Rent Control Act. Lease is not defined under the Rent Control Act. Lease is defined here. Like license is defined under the Easements Act. The lease is defined here. rental, a month-to-month tenancy is defined as the relevant rent tax. You'll find that in the City Protection Act also.
Thank you, sir.
In fact, this 85 judgment of Gyan Devi Prakash distinguishes between lease and, which is a full bench judgment, constitutional bench, 1985 Gyan Devi Prakash, Jeevan Anand. There they talk of lease, license and rent control registration. How they have to govern within this case.
Now, after the SARFAESI Act amendment, 17(4)(a) was brought in.
Yes.
They effectively speak 17(4)(a) of SARFAESI Act.
Yes.
After the Supreme Court judgments, they brought in the adjudication process before the DRT,
That's
where they speak only about lease and the consequences which flows out of Section 65.
Because 65A is that I told you about the appointment of receiver.
Yes.
Now you see the earlier regime, before this, if you go to that judgment of Pegasus, the argument was that whether the company, the same Companies Act could have precedence over securitization, whether all would affect the sale. The Supreme Court and the Delhi High Court said no, it is only under Securitization Act under Rule 8 could a sale be affected because this has primacy over the company.
So, in view of the judgments, can we today take it that the Rent Control Acts stand overwritten with the SARFAESI Act?
No, once the SARFAESI Act kicks in, then all these, even rent interest can be transferred, can be attached for appropriation of rents. But if you remember the old SICA Act, the Church of South India, the Church of North India judgment,
yes,
Agarwal in 93 opined that you cannot use the SICA method to throw out a tenant. You have to proceed under the rent. So that distinction has still not been played out under the Securitization Act. But there are judgments which say that you cannot use this mode to throw out a tenant. You can throw out a landlord, but not the tenant. That is it.
As such, there is no question. I think you can proceed with it.
Sir, thank you very much, sir. It was a very nice evening. The flow of law, the manner in which you have dealt with various acts, it was very, very astonishing. In fact, other than learning law from your lecture, in fact, we as advocates have also learned how to present things or how to conceptualize things, because this topic was very wide and we were in fact very curious enough to see how SAR is going to cover up every aspect of it, because we know people on lease alone will take about 1 hour, 1.5 hours. You said lease, license as well as gift, and bringing in the interplay with the various other enactments also. That was wonderfully done. It's a learning lesson for us, and I hope every participant of this session was more benefited. Thank you very much for your time and effort and the way you have taken us today evening in learning this special provisions of the Transfer of Property Act. As you rightly said, it is not a code by itself. It adds so many acts into it. And as time passes, in fact, more acts are coming into it to see that this Transfer of Property Act provisions are getting affected or displaced or more prone into the normal stream. So thank you very much, sir. On behalf of everyone, we thank you for the wonderful lecture.
I want to thank even my juniors who did all these notes and everything even at work. I was a bit worried about the width of the act. It's quite a big act. It has 137 sections, but the applicability is very huge. Like I said, the eminent domain concept also eats into the transfer of property. Your right is taken away by the sovereign power. So these are things which overlap, interact, and make this act a kind of standalone act, but dependent on other acts. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, sir.
And take care and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.